in many respects, if not all respects. We had two differing basic philosophies testing one another.
Racism in Hollywood doesn't always wear an ugly face. Sometimes it wears a tuxedo, holds a golden statue, and is called a legend. Dan Blocker said that in a private interview years after stepping away from the spotlight, he was no longer the gentle giant from Bonanza. He was simply a man who had seen too much and no longer had a reason to stay silent. According to Blocker, old Hollywood didn't practice racism only through open hatred, but through power that was carefully concealed. Some openly believed in white supremacy and used their fame to impose that worldview. Some sang about freedom, stood beside black artists in front of the cameras, yet locked the doors of power shut backstage. Others played the role of activists, rejected awards to be celebrated, only to dismiss the civil rights movement as mere media imagery once the lights went out. And most dangerous of all were those who never had to shout at all, who smiled, stayed polished and polite while quietly maintaining invisible lines of exclusion. This is the story of 7 legends of old Hollywood and the truths Dan Blocker believed they never wanted the audience to know. If you ever believed old Hollywood was only about glamour and legends like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts and keep watching, because what comes next may force you to rethink everything.
I think that capitalist is such an unpopular word. You know, it's in 200 years we've...
1. John Wayne, when masculinity turned racism into a public stance. Throughout the 20th century, if there was one face most often chosen to represent America on screen, it was John Wayne. He wasn't just a box office star, he was the embodiment of everything Hollywood wanted to package as American identity: rigid masculinity, absolute patriotism, and uncompromising righteousness. From Western cowboys to wartime soldiers, Wayne was always positioned as the guide, the victor, the man who brought order to a chaotic world. To the public, John Wayne was a man who never lied, never backed down, never got it wrong. That image was cultivated over decades through hundreds of roles, endless praise, and countless articles hailing him as the soul of America. Hollywood didn't merely celebrate Wayne as an actor, it elevated him into a moral benchmark. And that is precisely why what Dan Blocker later revealed became so dangerous. Some people don't just believe they stand above others. They believe history itself must be rewritten to prove it. Dan Blocker once said that if he had to choose a single person who most clearly represented the dark side of old Hollywood, he wouldn't hesitate. It would be John Wayne. Not because Wayne hid his hatred better than others, but because he never felt the need to hide it at all. For decades, John Wayne wasn't merely a movie star, he was a national symbol, the invincible cowboy, the American soldier bringing righteousness wherever he went. Hollywood didn't just give Wayne heroic roles, it gave him the authority to define what a hero was. And from that position, Wayne transformed his racist beliefs into a public, legitimate, and widely amplified stance. Unlike many contemporaries who chose silence to preserve their image, John Wayne spoke openly. In a 1971 interview with Playboy, he explicitly stated that he believed in white supremacy and that granting equal rights to Black Americans was moving too fast. There was no apology, no claim of misquotation. It was a clearly articulated worldview, delivered as self-evident truth. For Dan Blocker, that moment confirmed what he had long witnessed. Wayne was not accidentally outdated, he was actively aligned with inequality. That stance didn't stop at words. During the height of the civil rights movement, as America was deeply divided, Wayne publicly labeled civil rights activists as communist agitators. He didn't see the movement as a fight for survival and dignity, but as a threat to an order he believed was right. At public events and industry gatherings, Wayne spoke of civil rights not as something to be addressed, but something to be crushed. That hostility soon crossed the line from rhetoric into violence. In the late 1960s, at a press event in Los Angeles, Black journalist James Hicks directly questioned Wayne about his opposition to the Civil Rights Act. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't provocation. It was a request for accountability. Wayne responded with physical force, lunging at Hicks and assaulting him in front of multiple witnesses. There was no debate, no explanation, just fists and silence afterward. The incident never made major headlines. There were no legal consequences. And that silence revealed exactly how protected Wayne was.
I'm sad to see minorities make so much of themselves as a hyphenated American. I wish they'd all get to thinking that they're Americans as they should.
But what truly chilled Dan Blocker ran even deeper into how Wayne used his power to distort history itself. When producing The Alamo in 1960, Wayne didn't just star in the film, he controlled the entire project. During script development, Wayne ordered the removal or erasure of Mexican fighters' contributions, dismissing any portrayal of them as meaningful participants as colored propaganda. A single directive from Wayne was enough to force the writing team to rewrite history, turning a complex event into a monochrome myth. White men as the only heroes, all other ethnic groups reduced to background or erased entirely. And that system didn't stop on screen. In real life, Wayne built it into process. His production company Batjack Productions enforced whites-only hiring policies for years. Applications from Black, Mexican, or indigenous candidates were discarded immediately. No evaluation, no interviews. Skin color decided everything. Wayne didn't need to sign discriminatory memos. His presence at the top was enough for the system to function accordingly. To Dan Blocker, this was the real crime. Not a single slur. Not an isolated act of violence. But the way John Wayne used fame, power, and heroic imagery to normalize racism, to make it acceptable, even admirable. Wayne didn't hide his beliefs. He turned them into standards and forced Hollywood to revolve around them. Blocker once said John Wayne never had to shout that he stood above others. Hollywood automatically stood lower to serve him. And when such a figure goes unchallenged for too long, discrimination stops being a personal flaw, it becomes structure. But according to Dan Blocker, John Wayne was only the most blatant case a man willing to say aloud what he believed. Far more dangerous were those who spoke of freedom, sang of equality, and smiled politely while quietly locking the doors of power behind the scenes. And among them, the next name Blocker could not ignore was Frank Sinatra. 2. Frank Sinatra. When progressivism was only a mask for selective power. Frank Sinatra didn't hate black people, he just never allowed them to stand beside him. Dan Blocker. In the history of old Hollywood, few names were both as beloved and as fiercely protected as Frank Sinatra. He wasn't just a singer, he was a living legend. The voice of love, freedom, post-war America. Sinatra stepped onto stages as a symbol of openness, progress of a Hollywood that claimed to have moved beyond old prejudices. The public believed that image. Sinatra shared stages with black artists. He posed for photographs with them. He sang about fairness, humanity, a world without boundaries. To audiences, Sinatra seemed proof that Hollywood had changed that power and compassion could coexist.
It turned out that we didn't take a vote, but if we had, answering that would have lost.
Would have lost.
It would have lost.
Dan Blocker wanted to believe it too. But it was the nights without cameras, without press, without applause that showed Blocker a very different truth. Frank Sinatra didn't break boundaries. He simply learned how to look good standing in front of them. The first cracks appeared in performance contracts. At the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, the entertainment cathedral Sinatra dominated for years. There was an unwritten but strictly enforced rule: black artists were never allowed to headline on peak nights. They could open the show, they could energize the crowd, they could warm the audience before Sinatra stepped on stage. But the center slot, the prime hour, always belonged to him. The justification in internal clauses was just a few words not suitable for the hotel's image. No mention of race was needed. Everyone understood what it meant. Dan Blocker called it luxury racism. No shouting required just the right signature on the right contract line. And that boundary didn't end on stage. On major performance nights, black artists were barred from the VIP section where Sinatra and the elite gathered. They could perform for white audiences but not share the same privileged space. Equality in Sinatra's world only existed from a distance. Blocker once heard a photographer say Frank liked standing next to black people when the lights were on. He just didn't want to share power with them. That understanding explains an incident Hollywood tried hard to forget. One night in Las Vegas, during a show crowded with press, a black photographer took Sinatra's picture from an angle he didn't like. There was no warning. No request to delete the photo. Sinatra rushed him and beat him on the spot, hurling racial slurs as he did. The room froze. No one intervened. No one spoke. The photographer left in silence. Sinatra continued performing as if nothing had happened. There was no lawsuit, no major scandal. The story survived only in backstage whispers and in Dan Blocker's memory, where it confirmed that power never needs justification. But Sinatra wasn't just a volatile individual. He was a power center, and that power was used to sustain an entertainment system stratified by race. From Las Vegas to Miami, clubs where Sinatra performed operated on the same logic. Black artists could step onto the stage but never control it. They could be seen but not lead. They could be praised but never stand as equals. Under the guise of aesthetics and premium experience, Sinatra supported segregated spaces, divided audiences, and preserved the hierarchy from which he benefited most. No banners, no public rules, just quiet agreements upheld by fear and silence. Dan Blocker once said Frank Sinatra never had to ban anyone. He just made sure everyone knew where they belonged. That was a form of power more refined than violence, a power that made victims afraid to name what was happening. What angered Blocker most wasn't that Sinatra behaved in discriminatory ways. It was that he built an image that suggested the opposite. In public, Sinatra was a progressive icon. Behind the scenes, he guarded the gates of power and opened them only when his position wasn't threatened. Equality to Sinatra was a beautiful concept to sing about, not a reality to share. Blocker summed up Sinatra with bitter clarity. Some people talk about freedom as if they're granting it to the world. But that freedom always comes with conditions. And if Frank Sinatra showed Blocker the dark side of power hidden behind progressive imagery, the next name disappointed him even more. A man who didn't just talk about justice, but performed activism before the entire world. That man was Marlon Brando. 3. Marlon Brando, an activist created by the spotlight. Marlon Brando fought for justice best when someone was watching. Dan Blocker. To the public, Marlon Brando wasn't just a great actor. He was Hollywood's conscience, a man who challenged the system, refused to bow to power, and stood up for oppressed communities. Brando was seen as the embodiment of the rebellious artist, a star who valued justice over money or fame. Dan Blocker wanted to believe that too. On screen, Brando radiated seductive rebellion, carrying the aura of someone fundamentally different from the rest of Hollywood. He spoke about justice, human rights, and the responsibility of the famous. At a time when many stars chose silence, Brando seemed willing to stand at the front. That image made him a progressive icon, an artist with principles. The moment that cemented this reputation came in 1973 at the Academy Awards in Los Angeles. When The Godfather won Best Actor for Brando, he didn't take the stage. Instead, he sent Sacheen Littlefeather, a Native American woman, to accept the award on his behalf in protest of Hollywood's treatment of indigenous people. The room fell silent. The press exploded. Brando was hailed as a moral hero, a man willing to sacrifice personal glory for justice. Dan Blocker was backstage that night, and it was there, away from the lights, that he began to suspect the performance was too perfectly staged. Those doubts were later confirmed in private conversations. In personal notes, Blocker had access to Brando referred to Martin Luther King Jr. as a media product, as if the civil rights movement were not a life-or-death struggle for millions, but merely an image manufactured for public consumption. These weren't words spoken in anger. They were written, considered, and kept. Blocker heard the same sentiment directly from Brando at a closed party in Los Angeles in the early 1970s. When Martin Luther King Jr.'s name came up, Brando shrugged and said he was no different from a figure created for television. The room went quiet, not in agreement, but in disbelief that a man celebrated as a justice icon could speak so casually. But words were only the surface. What truly shattered Blocker's trust were actions that contradicted Brando's public image entirely. While Hollywood praised him as a voice for minorities' financial records, Blocker learned of showed Brando was accused of funneling money to an organization opposing interracial marriage. The group operated under the slogan protecting cultural purity, but in practice fueled fear and prejudice against people of color. None of Brando's speeches mentioned this. No interviews addressed it. The contradiction was buried beneath the glow of an activist persona. And then, there were moments that couldn't be denied. At a backstage award ceremony a few years after the 1973 Oscars, Brando was asked to present an award to a black artist. According to internal notes, Blocker read Brando refuse, saying it was not appropriate for the atmosphere of the event. When someone pointed out the winner deserved the honor, Brando delivered a line that froze the crew. "Winning is fine, but standing next to me on stage? Not yet." It wasn't public. It wasn't on camera. But in that moment, Blocker understood Brando's justice had limits, and those limits existed precisely where the spotlight didn't reach. To Dan Blocker, Marlon Brando wasn't an overt enemy of people of color like John Wayne, nor a cold power broker like Frank Sinatra. Brando was dangerous in a different way. He played the activist role so convincingly that the world forgot to ask questions. He knew when to appear, when to disappear, and when to say exactly what the public wanted to hear. Blocker once said Brando wasn't pretending. He truly believed he was on the right side as long as that right side was well lit. When the lights went out, so did the principles. That contradiction was what hurt Blocker most. A man who could stand on stage and speak about justice, then step backstage and operate within the old order. A man who could refuse an Oscar on camera yet refused to stand beside a black artist when no one was watching. To Blocker, that wasn't personal failure, it was morality performed. And if Marlon Brando showed Blocker that justice itself could become a role, the next name proved something else entirely. Sometimes the warmth audiences feel is only a shell hiding something cold and unsettling. That man was Bing Crosby. 4. Bing Crosby. Kindness built on quiet exclusion. Some people don't even need to hate anyone. They only need to treat others as if they don't deserve to exist in their world. Dan Blocker. If you had to choose one voice that made America feel safest in the 20th century, that voice would be Bing Crosby. White Christmas played in warm rooms among families beside Christmas trees, woven into the collective memory of millions. Crosby wasn't just a singer. He was the sound of gentleness, of family, of compassion, perfectly packaged by Hollywood. That's why when Dan Blocker spoke about Bing Crosby, his tone wasn't rage. It was something colder. Blocker once said the people who scream their hatred can be identified. The truly dangerous ones are the people who remain cold in silence. Crosby's public image was nearly spotless. The soft smile, the warm voice, the manner of a man everyone would want to invite into their home. Hollywood built him into a moral symbol, the model father, the scandal-free artist, the face of America's best values. But according to Dan Blocker, that very image was the perfect shell to hide a very different truth. That truth didn't come from tabloids, it came from family. In the memoir of his son Gary Crosby, Bing Crosby is described as someone who regularly used racial slurs against black people, Jewish people, Latinos, not in anger, not in drunken fury, but as part of everyday speech. Gary wrote that his father said those words as lightly as someone commenting on the weather. No emotion, no guilt, just the way he saw the world. To Dan Blocker, that detail was more frightening than any explosion. It revealed a kind of discrimination that didn't need justification because it had been internalized for so long. Not, "I hate you, but you don't belong here." And that attitude wasn't confined to language. It appeared in the spaces Crosby chose to inhabit. Crosby belonged to multiple elite clubs places built on excluding people of color. The rules didn't need signs. Who entered through the front door and who, if allowed at all, came through the back everyone understood. Crosby didn't object. He didn't question it. He accepted those rules as a natural part of social order and benefited from them. Dan Blocker once said Crosby didn't need to issue racist orders. He only needed to be comfortable inside a racist system. And that comfort is exactly what allowed the system to survive. What chilled Blocker was how Crosby kept the image of kindness while quietly reinforcing invisible lines. No shocking public statements, no on-camera violence, only consistent choices where he went, who he sat with, what spaces he treated as normal, and every choice pointed to the same message: certain people were simply not invited into his world. That contradiction becomes even more bitter when placed beside Crosby's music. His songs played during the warmest moments, Christmas family reunions, peaceful nights. That music made millions believe the man behind it was just as warm. But according to Dan Blocker, nothing is more dangerous than a kindness people believe without question. Blocker once observed Crosby didn't make people afraid. He made them feel safe. And in that safety and justice kept living. When someone can maintain privilege without speaking, without defending it, then silence itself becomes a stance. To Dan Blocker, Bing Crosby represented one of the hardest forms of racism to confront: quiet, not crude, not publicly controversial. It hid in habits and choices, in who was considered normal and who was excluded from the frame. That coldness didn't need anger to harm. It harmed by refusing to see others as human. Blocker once said, "A man can make an entire nation feel warm. That doesn't mean he's warm toward everyone." And with Crosby, the distance between those two truths was the most frightening part. But Bing Crosby, in Blocker's view, still wasn't the most disappointing case. Because some people don't just stay silent and benefit from the system, they wrap themselves in kindness, progressiveness, and moral goodness while actively drawing lines no one can see. The next man with that beautiful face was Paul Newman. 5. Paul Newman. Racism, wearing the mask of morality and kindness. Not everyone who speaks about kindness believes everyone deserves it. Dan Blocker. In Hollywood's collective memory, Paul Newman is almost a flawless ideal. The man with gentle blue eyes, a calm smile, a humble presence. He wasn't loud. He wasn't scandalous. He didn't flaunt power. Newman was celebrated as old Hollywood's nicest star, charitable, supportive of the poor, using fame for higher causes. Dan Blocker once believed Paul Newman truly was different. Newman represented the kind of progressiveness Hollywood loved. Progressive in words, moral in image, safe in practice. He didn't make hateful public statements like John Wayne. He didn't throw blunt power around like Frank Sinatra. And that was exactly why what Blocker later discovered felt even harder to accept. The truth emerged from a place few people watched closely: the world of auto racing. In the late 1960s, while the civil rights movement had already forced America to confront racism openly, Paul Newman owned and ran a professional racing team. For years, that team had no black drivers. Not because of a lack of talent, not because there were no qualified candidates, but because internally the justification was simple. Black drivers didn't fit the team's image. It wasn't until 1969, after America had already endured violent protests and bloodshed for equality, that the door even began to open. To Dan Blocker, that date didn't signal accidental delay. It signaled an intentional choice. Newman wasn't outside the system. He maintained an exclusionary system, only with softer language and a kinder face. But Newman's racism didn't stop at professional decisions. It appeared more clearly in private notes Blocker learned about. In personal writing, Newman described Jim Brown, a standout black football star and actor, through a lens of prejudice: rough, dangerous, doesn't belong in my Hollywood. Not something said casually in conversation, not a joke, a written worldview. To Dan Blocker, that was especially revealing. Jim Brown wasn't an outsider. He was an icon of discipline, intelligence, and talent. If Newman still saw him through fear, then the problem wasn't Jim Brown. It was his skin color. That contradiction became even sharper in Newman's social and political actions. While the public praised him as progressive, Newman wrote letters opposing school integration programs in Connecticut. His reasoning sounded reasonable, almost moral mixing. Black and white children could create social instability, unnecessary conflict harm the community. That was what enraged Dan Blocker. Newman didn't say he hated black people. He said he worried about order. He didn't say he wanted exclusion. He said he wanted protection. And that language made racism harder to detect because it was presented as care. Blocker once said, "Nothing is more dangerous than someone who believes they're doing the right thing while actually preserving injustice." Newman didn't need to shout his stance. He only needed to deliver it calmly, logically, and be applauded for it. To Dan Blocker, Paul Newman represented a more refined form of racism than anyone before him. No violence, no public hatred, no slurs on camera, only cold decisions covered in morality and a good man image. Newman didn't stand outside racial injustice. He stood exactly where it benefited him and called it kindness. Blocker concluded racism doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it smiles, donates to charity, and is praised as progressive. And that is why it lasts longer, runs deeper, and is far harder to challenge. But to Dan Blocker, even that hypocrisy wasn't the most painful truth. Because some people Hollywood pitied, protected, and sheltered the beloved victims later became capable of harming others just as deeply once they held power. The next name was Judy Garland. 6. Judy Garland. Personal tragedy does not equal innocence. Nothing is more dangerous than someone who believes their pain gives them the right to hurt others. Dan Blocker. In old Hollywood, few people were pitied as much as Judy Garland. The girl with the shimmering sad eyes from The Wizard of Oz was framed as a symbol of fragility, exploited, consumed by the studio system from childhood. Hollywood told Garland's story as a beautiful tragedy, great talent growing through suffering, a victim worthy of protection. Dan Blocker once believed that story too, but the more he witnessed, the more he recognized an uncomfortable truth: pain does not automatically create compassion. And in Judy Garland's case, personal tragedy didn't stop her from hurting others, especially black people. The early incidents didn't happen on grand stages, but on film sets. During the production of The Harvey Girls in the mid-1940s, Garland had a minor mishap. A black dancer accidentally brushed the fringe of her costume while moving in the background. It wasn't disrespect. There was no conflict, just a brief accidental touch in a crowded space. Garland's response, according to studio records, was to demand the dancer be fired immediately. MGM disciplinary files described Garland's reaction as excessive and punitive. No warning, no mediation. A man lost his job because of an accident, and because his skin color made Garland feel she had the right to punish him. Blocker read those notes and said plainly, this wasn't fragile panic. It was power used to exclude. But what angered Blocker even more happened off-set. In the early 1960s, at one of Garland's major performances, the show's director informed her that a group of black audience members, holders of the highest-priced tickets, had been seated in the front row. Garland exploded. Moments before going on stage, she shouted at staff that she couldn't sing with those people sitting directly in front of her. The demand was clear. Move them. The crew froze. No one challenged her. The group was asked to change seats to avoid upsetting the star. Garland stepped on stage, her voice flawless. The audience had no idea the warmth they were hearing had been paid for with humiliation. And then there were the words that couldn't be denied. According to Blocker, at backstage parties and moments without cameras, Garland used racial slurs about black people in front of crew members. Not a slip. Not drunken nonsense. A familiar tone spoken with the certainty of someone who believed she would never be held accountable. The moment Blocker couldn't ignore happened at a private party when Sammy Davis Jr., a colleague and one of the most prominent black entertainers of the era, approached to greet Garland. In front of others, Garland dropped a racial insult that turned the table to stone. No one laughed, no one intervened. Davis withdrew in silence. Garland continued the party as if she had said something normal, To Blocker, that moment exposed the bitter irony of Judy Garland, a person Hollywood sheltered because of her pain, yet who never sheltered others once she held power. Garland didn't need formal discriminatory policies. She had something stronger: star status and public sympathy, and Hollywood bowed to it. Blocker once said some people hurt others with fists. Garland did it with a contemptuous look and a nod. No noise, no major scandal. Only small decisions repeated over time: who stays, who gets pushed out, and the same group always suffered. What made Garland's story so disturbing wasn't that she had been hurt. It was that her pain became a moral license, a license to punish, to exclude, to believe she was always the victim, therefore she could never be the perpetrator. To Dan Blocker, Judy Garland was proof of a hard truth. Personal tragedy doesn't make someone better. It only gives them a choice. And Garland chose power, not compassion. But if Judy Garland showed Blocker how pain can become cruelty, the next name proved something else: how elegance and refinement can hide racism so effectively it becomes invisible. That name was Fred Astaire. 7. Fred Astaire. Classic refinement. Hiding invisible lines. Some people never need to say, "You can't stand beside me." They only need to make sure it never happens. Dan Blocker. If John Wayne represented loud hatred, Frank Sinatra represented conditional power, and Marlon Brando represented morality as performance, then to Dan Blocker, Fred Astaire represented something different: racism executed in absolute silence. Fred Astaire was never considered controversial. He was Hollywood's dancing gentleman, the definition of refinement, politeness, and pure art. No scandals, no shocking statements, no backstage drama. To the public, Astaire stood outside the moral conflicts of his era. That's why when Dan Blocker placed Astaire last on the list, many were surprised. But to Blocker, Astaire was proof that racism doesn't need noise to exist. It began on screen. In 1936, in Swing Time, Astaire performed a number promoted as a tribute to black tap legend Bill Bojangles Robinson. But Astaire's method of honoring a black artist was blackface, darkened skin, stereotyped makeup performed for white audiences. The man supposedly being honored didn't appear. He wasn't given space in the frame. To Dan Blocker, this wasn't an innocent mistake of the era. It was a clear message: black culture could be borrowed, but black people could not stand beside the star. And Swing Time wasn't an exception. Throughout his career, Astaire repeatedly pushed for all-white casting. He avoided scenes that placed black performers on equal footing with him, especially in symbolic or romantic contexts. No written bans, no public commands, only artistic choices repeated again and again, always producing the same result. Blocker called it racism without fingerprints. No one got screamed at, no one was publicly fired with drama, and yet no one was invited into the spotlight either. The irony grows even sharper when you look at Astaire's musical and jazz films. He built his career on styles deeply rooted in black communities, rhythm movement inspiration. Yet on screen, actual black musicians were almost nowhere to be seen. Jazz was scrubbed clean, dance was refined, culture was distilled while the people themselves were erased. Fred Astaire didn't need to say he didn't want to share the stage. He simply never did. Dan Blocker once said it was Astaire's very politeness that made everything harder to challenge. Because when there are no hateful words, no violence, no obvious conflict, the public is quick to assume nothing is wrong. But Blocker saw it clearly. Every professional decision Astaire made reinforced an invisible line. A line between who gets labeled art and who gets reduced to inspiration. Astaire didn't have to defend his privilege. He only had to let it continue, and Hollywood, as always, called that silence class. To Dan Blocker, Fred Astaire was the perfect closing note to the portrait of old Hollywood. Not because he was the cruelest, but because he revealed something even more unsettling. Racism doesn't always wear an ugly face. Sometimes it wears a tuxedo, smiles politely, and gets called cultural legacy. And that's exactly why it lasts the longest. Dan Blocker didn't tell these stories to destroy legends. He told them because it was time someone said out loud what Hollywood had grown comfortable pretending not to see. through John Wayne, Frank Sinatra, Marlon Brando, Bing Crosby, Paul Newman, Judy Garland, and Fred Astaire Blocker, wasn't just exposing individuals, he was exposing a system where power, fame, and silence worked together to make racism feel normal. These people weren't the same. Some shouted their supremacist beliefs openly, some used cold power to maintain the line, some wore a progressive mask to hide exclusion, some smiled kindly while benefiting from an unjust order. But they all shared one thing: they were protected by the glow of their own legend. Old Hollywood loved to tell stories about bright lights, about dreams, about greatness. But Dan Blocker knew those lights only illuminated one side. On the other side were the people pushed out of the frame, off the stage, out of opportunity, not because of talent, but because of skin color. And what allowed that truth to survive for so long wasn't only hatred, it was collective silence. Blocker once said Hollywood doesn't just create stars, it creates what we are allowed to forget. And for years, people forgot or chose not to remember that behind warm voices, elegant dance steps, and moral speeches, there were invisible boundaries built strong and reinforced again and again. Out of all the names mentioned, who disappointed you the most? Who made you realize that a public image can be nothing more than a role performed for too long? Leave a comment below, not to condemn the past, but to refuse repeating its silence. If you believe these stories need to be told, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this is only the surface of what old Hollywood worked so hard to bury. And remember, not every legend deserves to be worshipped, but the truth always deserves to be spoken.